going to be so lucky to be hearing from him today. I'm going to save all the accolades for Salsa, who's going to officially introduce him. But I'm grateful for you joining us, Kim, and I'm really excited about the next stage of your career because it's not yet announced. You guys are the first to know, but he was just named chairman of the Department of Medicine at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. So he will be leaving Chicago for the first time in forever. All right, Celso, take it away.
Wonderful. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce today's speaker for Grand Rounds, Dr. Kim Williams. So Dr. Williams is currently the Chief of Cardiology and Associate Dean for Faculty Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rush University Medical Center. He completed his medical school at the University of Chicago and his medicine residency at Emory University before returning back to University of Chicago for his cardiology fellowship, as well as an advanced fellowship in nuclear medicine. Dr. Williams has previously served as president of the American College of Cardiology, chairman of the board of the Association of Black Cardiologists. He was also a founding member and president of the American Society of Nuclear Cardiology and co-chair of the ACC Diversity and Inclusion Task Force. He also recently served on the ACC-AHA Guideline Committee on Primary Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease. He has been an incredible advocate for diversity and inclusion throughout his career, and additionally, he is passionate about the role of diet and nutrition in preventing cardiovascular disease and currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Disease Reversal and Prevention. Again, it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Williams, and it is an absolute honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Celso. That was a wonderful introduction. Maybe I could download that one. You did that so well. And thank you, Dr. Watson. I really appreciate I have to shout out to your leadership throughout your career in the area of prevention. And we've learned so much from you and all of your leadership and Association of Black Cardiologists and ACC-AHA guidelines. You've been very much amazing. I would like to spend a fair amount of time today talking about my favorite topic, which is nutrition, but you'll see that it's only part of the issue. And I've entitled it Dueling the Dual Pandemic. And it really has to do with the fact that COVID-19 really did put an acute window of opportunity into the cardiovascular mortality because of the fact that the risk factors for having a bad outcome from COVID were really the things that we in preventive cardiology have been dealing with for decades. So, but let's talk about nutrition just for a moment, and you're going to see us going back and forth between COVID and heart disease because they overlap so much. But this is one that everybody should know about. And this is being updated and published. And the fact is that over in 2017, it was published that, published about 2017, that there are 11 million deaths and 250 million disability adjusted life years that would attribute it to dietary factors. So we now have guidelines that say you shouldn't do sodium, you shouldn't do refined grains, you should do whole grains and more fruits and vegetables. And if everybody did that, the death rate from cardiovascular disease would go down. It's a particularly acute in the United States, and that is because we market to poor people more unhealthy food than any other place. And so we end up with this, one of the best medical systems in the world and one of the poorest life expectancies when you compare it with the amount of dollars that we spend. And at some point, we would love to join the rest of the, of the advanced world instead of lagging behind so far. And there we go. Okay, so switching back for a moment to COVID-19. This is a wonderful, complex slide talking about all the things that have been put together that can affect the outcomes, not just the susceptibility to, but the progression of COVID-19. And a lot of them are actually lifestyle. It's where you live, it's what you eat, it's whether or not you're exercising. Are you undernourished? Are you overnourished? And if we put all of these together, we would have had a wonderful opportunity to actually change the outcome for millions of people if everyone understood that it was not race. Everyone heard over and over again that people of color die of COVID-19, and the data was actually very clear that if you do the adjustment for all the covariables, particularly obesity, but also social factors, what you find out is that being Black or being brown was not associated with higher mortality. It was actually once you adjust it. And in fact, every analysis we did, including one that we did at Rush, so there was a tiny bit of protection. I don't know what that was about, but it may be overcorrection. But the fact of the matter is, if we had people who were not obese, we would have had and diabetic and hypertensive with high cholesterol, we would have done better. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the kind of studies that have been done over the years to try to convince you that nutrition is important for those risk factors, and that when you do dietary intervention, that you can change those risk factors. So here's your classic Atkins, and we'll talk about the problems with that later, counting calories, Dean Ornish and his completely vegan diet, and losing weight. And when you look at it, the fact of the matter is, we have good data that if you do a plant-based diet, you can have sustained improvement in your weight. How about diabetes? It turns out that there's really good data that if you change a person who's diabetic to a plant-based diet, away from what they've been eating, you will get a substantial decrease in hemoglobin A1C. How about blood pressure? This is a wonderful meta-analysis, a massive amount of data. We've co-opted it into our 2017 hypertension guidelines. So if you read those guidelines and follow them, please do. We we were accused of lowering the target to from 140 to 130, so that we were in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry or something. I mean, a lot of criticisms were dealt. Fact of the matter is, no, we didn't have conflicts of interest. We were talking about lifestyle. And if people read the document, they wouldn't talk about drugs as much, because we were talking about pretty much avoiding drugs unless the person's blood pressure is really off the charts. Yeah. And so how do you do that? Diet, decreasing the amount of sodium. People are increasing the amount of exercise. But diet is really key. And among the dietary interventions, DASH being one of the best that was ever done, you would see that if you did a low fat, low cholesterol, that means primarily vegetarian diet, that's the one with the most marked decrease in blood pressure. So please remember that. Now, how about cholesterol? It turns out that the interventions in cholesterol are very similar, with very few showing that when you go to a plant-based diet, and I know it's sort of lazily called vegan, but what we really mean is a whole food plant-based diet, what you end up with is a dramatic or modest decrease in cholesterol. And I know there are some rare studies that show that the LDL, and I've actually had patients that they fit just like the meta-analysis. I get people one or two people in my entire career, they go on a plant-based diet, and they actually have an increase in their LDL cholesterol. But the vast majority, over 90%, 95% of people are going to have an impact. It's going to be somewhere between, I used to say 30 to 50%, but 2 weeks ago, I saw a guy, cholesterol off the charts, I gave him the vegan lecture because he didn't want statins, and he came back 3 months later with an 86% decrease. That's a little bit more on the excessive side, but there are people who highly respond to nutrition for their cholesterol. And so when you look at some of these dietary interventions, and this is one of the classic ones because there aren't very many, it's diet versus a control group. But this is one where they actually had statins as well, published in JAMA in 2003 from David Jenkins' group, so-called portfolio diet. What was in the portfolio? Handful of almonds 3 times a day, plant sterols, black bean soup, soy meat, and a whole food plant-based diet. And it turns out that, and psyllium, so Metamucil. And if you do all that, what you find is that there's a dramatic drop in LDL cholesterol. It was just as good as their statin control group or intervention group, way better than control. And what you saw is a lowering of inflammation. And so please remember that one. It's not just about LDL. When you do a diet, much like the Jupiter trial and the statins, you will decrease both LDL and lower the C-reactive protein. This was revisited by Bonita Shaw a couple of years ago, and I'm really proud of the American Heart Association for publishing an article saying that the American Heart Association diet does not work in terms of lowering the amount of C-reactive protein, whereas the vegan diet was very effective, a 28% drop. Now, So I've convinced you that all of these hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and hyperlipidemia that you can influence it with diet. We've had this data for a long time, but what you hadn't seen so much is what's on this slide, and it's going to dominate most of this talk. That is, we just thought, you know, you lower the sodium, your blood pressure goes down. You stop eating cholesterol, your cholesterol goes down. You stop eating sugar, your diabetes goes down, and you're not, you know, feeding fat cells with insulin because of the sugar that you ate. Well, it turns out that it's a little more complex than that. And so what you're seeing and what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes is the microbiome. And hopefully everyone is starting to see some of this data. It's really come to a head over the last few really months to the year or two, probably mostly because of COVID. And, you know, this whole thing about nutrition and COVID and vegans don't die of COVID. And I'll show you some of the data about even moderate to severe illness going down. And it's because of the microbiome, and people who have a plant-based diet, they cannot generate a cytokine storm because they don't have the species of bacteria. But this is such a foreign territory, getting back to microbiology. I know many of you are younger and you didn't take microbiology in 1976 like I did. So I had to go back and learn a lot of stuff. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. Okay, what is the microbiome? Well, this was the shocking fact that my audience, I'm actually not speaking to humans mostly. On average, we are only 43% human. If you look at us by cell counts, if you look at it by genes, it's way less than that. It's like 1 in 1,000 are actually human. What's the rest? It's the parasites, the bacteria, fungi, protozoa, viruses, and they are small, so they don't weigh a lot of, they're not a lot of weight, but they have important roles. And you see them listed here, but the most important are this whole idea, and I have to mention neurologic stuff is probably way more important than cardiovascular stuff at this point. Alzheimer's disease, autism, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, all being influenced by the microbiome, by having a harmful set of species in your microbiome. And so you're going to see much more of this. Different kinds of therapy, targeted therapy, untargeted therapy, getting people to exercise. You know, we've been, you know, let's move, Michelle Obama, nobody did. Then it was F&V, do the fruits and vegetables. Hopefully people will start to do more of that because they're not doing it now. But the fact of the matter is, it turns out that all of these interventions that we thought were so good because they're of what we thought they were doing, it turns out that they are affecting the microbiome. And changing the species when you run, changing the species when you eat more plants. These are the kinds of improvements in microbial composition and function that are going to save us from these diseases and the risk factors. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the risk factors themselves. Hypertension. You're going to see more and more data on this particular issue. The fact is, sure, there are genetic factors, environmental, hormonal and inflammation. And when you do a plant-based diet, you end up with more dietary fiber. That gets more short-chain fatty acids and anti-inflammatory immune cells that reduces the blood pressure. And even just fasting, and we've had this data since the 1930s with the Kempner rice diet, prolonged fasting reduces hypertension. When you have a variety of benign and helpful bacteria, you end up with a lower blood pressure, and reducing the good bacteria, a dysbiotic one, less alpha diversity is present in hypertensive patients, which are the bad guys, Klebsiella, et cetera, and they're associated with a higher degree of blood pressure. And this is not just in the United States. There's data coming in from internationally as well, that is intestinal microbiota that are harmful, causing dysbiosis and inflammation, result in much more in the way of blood pressure. And these graphs may look very similar, but there's a very subtle change in the species, altering the species in your GI tract that make more acetate and butyrate result in more blood pressure. And so you might not change the species, but change the abundance of each species, and that will make a difference in 24-hour blood pressure. Let's talk about cholesterol. Okay, so I probably Dr. Watson would be the exception, but most of us who aren't total lipidologists have never even heard the word caprostenol. Well, there's a good reason you never heard of it, because it doesn't hurt anyone. And so how do we get caprostenol? It's from the having a wonderful microbiome that has the IS-MA gene that actually is a microbial cholesterol dehydrogenase. And if you have the IS-MA species in your GI tract, you end up with less fecal and serum cholesterol because it gets converted to caprostenol. And so how do we do that? Well, I'm not going to be surprised at randomized trials that are done with probiotics that have the microbiome that has the IS-MA gene that may become a therapy, but the easiest way to do it is to do a plant-based diet. A dietary intervention will change this. Now, this is your typical cholesterol synthesis and dietary. As you know, everything you eat and everything you make ends up going into your GI tract, and there it's going to get absorbed unless you're inhibiting your Niemann-Pick-like-1 enzyme, which you do with ezetimibe. And then that lowers your serum cholesterol. But how about just metabolizing it from cholesterol to caprostenol and doing that more? And that way you actually will decrease that risk. Okay, how about type 2 diabetes? Well, it turns out that there are multiple studies, many studies, talking about microbial associations with this disease. And we know who the good guys are, Ruminococcus, et cetera. We know who the bad guys are. And if we focus on this, you're going to see more and more data being published, talking about complex looking graphs like that, really not that complex. The green ones are beneficial, the blue ones are beneficial. They lower the amount of diabetes that people have. And you can go species by species and figure out which ones are associated with the development of type 2 diabetes and which ones are not. And we're going to get more data on that, and I assume we're going to get more intervention. Why do I say that? Because people are not always interested in changing their diet, and they would do just about anything to keep doing what they're doing. Doctor, I'm coming to you in cardiology, so you can give me a pill so I can go back and do the things that brought me here in the first place. But if we can change the culture, we can change the microbiome. So here's a nice picture of the green ones. The red ones are bad. The blue ones are good. You might not want to memorize this slide just yet because it's in development. But the fact is, we have bacteria that will promote diabetes, and we have those that'll take it away. Really important to talk about obesity. Many of you have heard this whole idea that fecal transplant. If you take an obese person or mouse and you take the feces and you give them to a thin person or mouse, that will develop or produce more obesity. And the reverse is true as well. You can make people thinner by changing out the microbiome into the type of bacteria that will get rid of the tendency toward hyperabsorption of everything and result in less obesity. It's interesting that we talked about exercise. Turns out bariatric surgery also changes the gut microbiota. And so these are interventions that we're going to see much more of. The amount of fasting-induced adipose factor will actually improve if we do a plant-based diet. Okay, I'm going to take those basic risk factors that we thought we were controlling for good reasons, and it turns out there was a whole underlying reason that we didn't know. And I'm going to talk about one specific aspect of the microbiome, and that is trimethylamine N oxide. And for this, I have to shout out to the Cleveland Clinic, who published this almost 10 years ago, talking about eating animal products with dietary phosphatidylcholine and ending up with your gut flora, the microbiome, converting these compounds into trimethylamine, which is then oxidized into trimethylamine N oxide, which they associated back then with heart attack, stroke, and death. And they thought it was atherogenic and that it would cause instability of plaque. And it turns out they've done so much more, as you would expect, in the last decade. And everybody should know this 4-letter word, and everyone who reads about it is very likely to go become a plant-based person, because you don't want to have the microbiome that would make TMAO, and you don't want to have the substrate. So none of the kind of the eggs and meat and that kind of thing that's going to make a dysbiotic microbiome. So it turns out that it looks very complicated, but we've learned that it's more than just heart attack, stroke, and death. It is renal disease. It is a variety of neurologic diseases. And what we really need to get people to understand is that you can change it. And so just moving from red meat to white meat, and we'll talk about the differences, and you'll hear people saying, well, that is a good idea, and it probably is. And I always say that, if you're going to go from red meat to white meat, you're actually going to lower your TMAO level. And so sure, you'll see that a white meat intervention will tend to lower your TMAO level. And conversely, a red meat intervention will increase it. And so, but what is that going to do to disease? Well, this is probably one of the most important things you'll see out of Cleveland Clinic in this regard, and that is platelet aggregation. And it's a complex, busy-looking slide, basically talking about when you're vegan or vegetarian, you're going to have less platelet aggregation because you have a lower TMAO level than you would if you were eating animal products, particularly red meat. And when you look at the people who are eat meat and taking aspirin, their platelet aggregation is going to be about the same as the person who is not eating animal products. So you automatically have a sort of an anti-platelet, less thrombogenic profile if you're not eating red meat and ending up with an elevated TMAO level. So that's a nice basic science thing. But how about the correlation with outcomes? Well, this was one of their original publications, heart attack, stroke, and death. The higher the TMAO level, the worse their survival. It wasn't just that, it was heart failure as well. And so, Dr. F.A.H.A has been working on all the drugs and all the interventions. It turns out that if you take people and make them completely plant-based and lower their TMAO level, their survival is going to be so much better. So we now have, I'm showing you some old studies. This is a decade ago. Walter Willett, Frank Hugh from Harvard, describing the correlation between red meat consumption and mortality. Bottom line, red meat kills. Processed red meat kills faster. It's not just cardiovascular disease, it's cancer as well. I should say that. It's dose related. So people who say, everything in moderation, notice that the biggest slope in the curve is between 0 and 1 serving per day. And that was nurses' health. But there's a whole lot of other epidemiologic studies that says the same thing. Meat consumption increases ischemic heart disease. Unprocessed meat is not quite as bad as processed meat, about half as bad, but it still increases the mortality. Coronary disease in the United States, same issue. And just about anything you put on a plate that's not red meat would actually lower the mortality. This one from the Harvard group, Nurses Health, didn't show a big advantage of fish. A little surprised at that based on a lot of their other epidemiologic data, but soybeans, nuts, beans, plant-based proteins, those are the things that can really generate a better outcome. Have to mention heart failure. And again, because it's weaved throughout the nutrition literature these days that processed and unprocessed red meat, how did it increase the mortality? A lot of it actually was heart attack, stroke, and heart failure. Particularly a 243% increase in heart failure mortality if people are eating processed meat. Not everybody knows what processed meat is. That would be bacon, ham, sausage, hot dogs. I think jerky falls into that category as well. And a lot of it's nitrates, but it's the whole idea of taking red meat and changing it, putting more sodium in it. It may taste good, but not for long, to put it bluntly. All right, and so dietary patterns with heart failure, we have data that actually does the reverse, or has shown the reverse. Kyla Lara did this. She's up at Mayo Clinic now, doing these analyses of the REGARDS trial. saying that when you're eating animal products, you're increasing your heart failure risk. You do a plant-based dietary pattern and you get a 41% lower risk of heart failure. Now, people talk about eggs because they're marketed so well, egg board, incredible edible. Well, the data is very clear that the more you eat, the more mortality you have. And where does it reach statistical significance? Well, in that population, it was actually about a half an egg a day. But with that hazard ratio going up and up and up, you can imagine that, something like, the ezetimibe trial that showed a 6% improvement, but got into the guidelines because they had, like 144,000 patient years in it. That was reduce it. And it turns out that if you have a large enough sample size, you will find statistical significance probably at a much lower level than a half an egg. So I'm saying that to say, I agree, it's wonderful to have this data, but this should not say that less than half an egg is necessarily safe. Okay. There's one criticism of this. There's a lot of criticism of this, but I don't think most of them are valid. One of them was that it was an American phenomenon because that you couldn't ferret out the fact that people were eating eggs or eating bacon, or they're putting it on a egg mick whatever. Well, it turns out that the Italians had a similar analysis published last year and or a few months ago actually, and guess what they said? More than 4 eggs a week. Well, that's about a half an egg a day. So the data is very clear. If you're even 2 to 4 eggs per week is associated with an all-cause mortality, but it increases hypertension and hyperlipidemia as well. So that brings us to the probably the biggest point that any of us want to hear in nutrition, and that is, excuse me, that the Nurses' Health and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, and most people listening today are nurses and doctors, have to understand that if you have any risk factors, and I want to emphasize that there has to be a risk factor, then this data applies to you. That is, cardiovascular disease is uniquely associated with consumption of animal products, for there are no safe animal products, that if you look at the poultry and fish, the so-called white meat, they are way better, but they still increase mortality. And they're a hair better than the dairy. Dairy is a hair better than unprocessed red meat, which is better than eggs, which is better than processed meat. And so, when people say, well, I'm switching from processed meat to, fish and poultry, I would say based on this data, that's great. You've changed from eating cyanide to eating arsenic. And that's a positive step in the right direction. So this, I should say that this was criticized over and over again, that it can't be right. There's Nurses' Health, Harvard, they're all wrong. This was published, if you put in vegetable protein versus animal protein from JAMA, you'll actually see 3 of them. One in 2016, that's this one in 2019, and one from 2020, all of them saying the same thing. When you eat animal products, you're actually putting yourself in risk. And this is the Cardia trial saying basically the same thing. The more plant-based you are, the more your hazard ratio for cardiovascular disease and mortality actually is there. Before going too far down the cardiovascular arena alone, we've learned over the years that we have to pay attention to the kidney. And the fact is that if you look at people with chronic kidney disease, they have a dramatically high number of issues that affect the heart. And there's about 12 different mechanisms for cardiovascular death. And in a population where renal replacement therapy is available, what we end up with is people on dialysis dying of heart disease. And it has to do with endothelin levels being high and epinephrine, catecholamine levels being high. And it has to do with the EPCs, the endothelial progenitor cells, don't come out of the bone marrow. The statins may help that, but you really struggle in doing any vascular repair. There's volume overload, there's chronic hypertension. And then with dialysis, you get these big drops in blood pressure that the microvasculature of the heart may not tolerate well. Just go on and on and on. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of data recently that ends up with cardiorenal disease being in this talk, because it turns out that it's all about animal protein. And I'm really struggling as I talk to my nephrology colleagues getting them to understand, the nephrology literature from the last 2 years is saying that if you put people on a plant-based diet, you can get their chronic kidney disease to actually improve as opposed to be progressive. That if they're eating red meat, they're dramatically increasing their risk of ending up with end-stage renal disease. That if you go on a plant-based diet, you're going to decrease the gut-dependent TMAO levels that increases mortality risk and chronic kidney disease. And so poorer long-term survival. We're not talking, vegan propaganda journals. We're talking, National Kidney Foundations saying the Nature Reviews in Nephrology, all of them saying the same thing, that everyone who has any hint of or risk of kidney disease ought to be on a plant-based diet. What are the misconceptions out there? That if you don't do animal protein, you won't have enough biological value. That's completely not true. You don't see protein deficient vegans. Well, I did publish one who was orthorexia nervosa, eating just like 4 different plant things and nothing else. But people shouldn't be doing that. Just remembering that animal products do not have any fiber, and so they don't have an opportunity to improve their microbiome. And you have plant fats, particularly olive oil, are anti-inflammatory and anti-atherogenic. The plants, and this is a key point, put it in green, that plants have a low endogenous acid load. And so you've heard this stuff, maybe you haven't heard it, but how dairy was purported for improvement of osteoporosis, one of the best examples. Well, it turns out chronically eating dairy, that acid load from buffering the protein, guess where it comes from? That buffering comes from the bones. So you end up with more fractures if you're doing dairy. It's also true of kidney disease because the metabolic acid, that acid load from trying to process those kinds of amino acids that are associated with animal products, end up with kidney disease. I get a bunch of pushback on plant-based diets from the nephrology dietitians saying there's too much phosphorus. And what they're not recognizing is that the phosphorus is bound to phytates. And so that means that it's less bioavailable than it would be from an animal product. So go ahead, it's not going to raise your phosphorus level. Same thing with hyperkalemia. That one is very real. You actually, if you're particularly on and everyone knows that, the ability, unless you're like type 4 renal acidosis, the ability to excrete potassium is one of the last things to go. And if you're already on an end-stage renal disease, you're going to be dialyzed anyway. And so you can not worry about it so much. And if the potassium is rising on a plant-based diet, you can always give people a list of things that have lower potassium. So I'm going to switch over for a moment again as I oscillate like a tennis ball on a court between cardiovascular and COVID, because this is really one of the biggest lessons that to come out of the pandemic. And I can look at it a little bit in the rearview mirror and say, should we have had the guts to go vegan? All the puns in there are intended, because this really is about all of our risk factors, changing them all, changing the gut microbiome and lowering the risk factors. It turns out that elevated cholesterol was an increased COVID-19 lethality. Why? Because it became a transport protein to let the virus into the cell. And so if you have a lower amount of tissue cholesterol level, you end up with a lower severity of COVID-19. It turns out that we long had the association from almost the beginning that smoking was bad for you, but BMI elevation was actually also bad for you. Not having physical activity, more COVID illness. And so a healthy lifestyle. And then this one was published. And so I have to shout out that before this was published, the PCRM, that's Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, within a month of the COVID pandemic, based on the risk factors and just logic, they were saying that people need to go plant-based. But I don't think it didn't really catch on publication-wise until British Medical Journal last October. And what it basically says is that when you look at plant-based diet versus pesco-vegetarian versus keto, that you get a dramatic reduction in COVID-19 severity. And so this had been going on. I got to interject in my own lecture here, this had been going on in the vegan community on Twitter, everybody talking to each other, that none of the vegans were dying of COVID. They could get it, they could get sick, but they wouldn't die. And most of them would actually, not get very much and, feel like they had a little sniffle or something. Well, this is sort of the statistical corroboration of lower amount of illness, a 73% reduction in moderate to severe illness if a person was plant-based. Now, the vegans were then saying, well, then we don't have to worry about COVID. We don't have to have vaccines. And I'm saying, absolutely not. And there were some, very prominent vegan cardiology people saying that, don't get the jab. Well, fact of the matter is, you do it for everyone else. The vegans are the most dangerous people for COVID because they'll never feel it, most of them. And they're going around and, give it to some kid who gives it to their grandmother. And, you never know the person who you hurt by not getting the vaccine. So hopefully that message got out there and enough people are vaccinated, but I know there's still some holdouts and, maybe it'll be okay because, Omicron doesn't seem to be followed by something, at least not immediately. So, but please remember that we have plenty of reasons to do plant-based nutrition, but COVID is among them. Because of dramatic lowering, and I should mention, because I'll talk about it in a moment, if you're doing that low carb, high protein diet, eating a lot of animal products, you're increasing your LDL, you're increasing your degree of inflammation, you're increasing TMAO, and you're increasing the odds of having a bad outcome from COVID. And so a lot of that has to do, again, with the microbiome and the cytokine storm that you can't get if you don't have the dysfunctional immune response of having a dysbiotic microbiome. And so plant-based nutrition lowers the likelihood of inflammatory markers going sky high with COVID. And so I want to spend the last few minutes actually talking about the intervention that we did at Rush on the south side of Chicago. As you know, we have healthcare disparities, and some of them are terrible. One of them that is harder to listen to or to hear is that NYU published a study in November of 2019 that looked at the United States and said that the biggest difference in neighborhood by neighborhood life expectancy was actually in Chicago. It was the Inglewood neighborhood on the south side where I grew up versus Streeterville, which if you've been in Chicago, it's just north of Northwestern. Downtown campus. And so that is a 30.1 year life expectancy difference. And sure, there are gangs, drugs, there are people dying of COVID because they had to go on, they couldn't hole up in their job where they could just white collar job, go online and be very effective. They had to go and, drive a bus and do whatever, much like the healthcare working community. And so what we ended up with is a lot of opportunity for dietary intervention because our risk factors are extremely high. When you talk about chronic kidney disease, it's not just stroke, hypertension, diabetes, and premature heart attacks. It's chronic kidney disease as well. And that's a favorite one of mine, not just because my dad on the south side of Chicago had sudden death after dialysis one time. It really is about the fact that we have to look at this as a blight on society. And I know I usually get in trouble for saying this, but we meaning African Americans, are 13% of the population, but 35% of the dialysis patients. And our Medicare system is paying about $91,000 per beneficiary, and you become a beneficiary the moment you've had dialysis for 2 months. And so we don't have the tax base to pay for that. And so everyone else is paying for us. How about we take some responsibility and change our diets? Okay, so I know that's never a popular until I show people the data and they say, oh, well, you're right. Okay, so what's the message? Let's do some interventions. So we actually did one. We found out that our Southside churches, unlike the church I grew up in, because it was so long ago, Lent, doing something for Lent was a Catholic thing back then, but now Baptist churches, just about everybody is doing something for Lent. And rather than just giving up soda pop or giving up smoking, which is a great idea, How about we give up animal products? And so I got 50 people to volunteer, 53 actually, to volunteer to do 5 weeks intervention over Lent, and then we draw your blood again on Easter Day and see what happens. We designed the trial based on the publication that was about to happen, because I was on this guideline committee, so I knew what they were going to say. And we designed to try and only intervene on this corner. Intake of fruit and vegetables, more legumes. Fish was in the guidelines based on, again, that's arsenic versus cyanide. But and they would be then beneficial, but everything else has really good type of information about it. So more of a diet like that, replacing saturated fat, replacing cholesterol and sodium, getting rid of processed meat particularly, and refined carbohydrates, sugar, that includes sugar sweetened beverages, as well as trans fats. The last one you're probably aware isn't much of a problem in the United States. We're one of 4 countries in the planet, Denmark, Sweden, Canada, and United States, where no one is allowed to serve you trans fats in a restaurant anymore, but you still want to look for it in things that you buy. Well, this is the result. We measured risk factors before and after, and the biggest changes were insulin levels and TMAO. And the insulin levels, really, we were taking a population that was substantially overweight. They lost on average 10 pounds per person. Their blood sugar got better. Their hemoglobin A1C, this looks small in terms of percent change, but it happened in every single one. So this was one of the more highly statistically significant results. But LDL, the little surprise, Dr. Watson will be surprised, is the 10% decrease in LP(a). We thought we were the first to show that, because rumor on the street was that it doesn't respond to diet. Turns out that we were second. Baxter Montgomery, who runs an African-American plant-based intervention center in Houston, actually showed the same thing with a plant-based intervention for a similar amount of time. So the C-reactive protein went down, small dense LDL took a plummet. So improving the microbiome and changing what's ingested, more fiber, no animals, really did work. And so the one thing that we did was to actually try and model their baseline ASCVD risk and then see what happens to them when we plugged in the new numbers. And we had eliminated 19% of the risk. Well, as it turns out, you probably have heard this before, that African Americans in general have about a 21% increase in cardiovascular mortality over other populations in the United States. And it looks like we were able to eliminate just about all of that. Yeah, the problem is there's not longevity. Our follow-up study said that about 1/3 of people really did change completely. Another third made partial changes, and 1/3 didn't even answer. So I know what the answer is, that they went back after the free food was gone. And I understand that we're talking about cultural changes, changing how you have eaten all your life. And it's one thing to do it for Lent, but can you do it for the rest of your life? And so we have to work on education and getting more data out there to people to understand that this is something that they should be doing, not just as a part-time or a temporary intervention. We have publicized with the Association of Black Cardiologists and Baxter Montgomery, who I just mentioned. We're co-authors on this. Well, it was my idea and then he did it. That's, to be honest, because he does teach people cooking, whereas I just, cook stuff for myself. Anyway, it turns out the Heart and Soul Cookbook is available on the abcardio.org website. So please look it up and share it with all your patients. Everything is completely plant-based and designed to improve cardiac health. And so I would say that to summarize all of this, it really comes down to this. That is, when you do a vegan vegetarian diet, you will change and adopt that ABC type diet, you will change everything. You will change all the risk factors. You'll change whatever COVID is left. You will change the chronic kidney disease, and getting the vegan and vegetarian type of microbiome, getting rid of the getting more of the Bacteroides species, for example, it takes somewhere between 4 and 14 days. And so we could have eliminated the severity of this COVID. Apparently, we would have been able to get rid of it in about 2 weeks if we had made everyone go vegan. So to end up, and I'm just going to leave a few minutes for questions. I would say that we have an opportunity now, a new window that most people have not taken advantage of, and I emphasize that because I get a lot of people with coronary disease who they've had a stent, they've had bypass surgery, and no one talked to them about their diet. And I have a fair number of people on the other side. They come to me for a vegan diet and they are doing everything they can to avoid statins. Well, that's great unless you have disease, and then you need both. And I would say that the best way to get to that ESC target of an LDL less than 55 is a whole food plant-based diet, exercise, and appropriate lipid lowering therapy. And basically it happens in everyone. So the heart disease, kidney disease, stroke, they're all increasing. They are our lifestyle choices. They are our television commercials. And it turns out that the poorer people watch more television. And so the unhealthy commercials are actually being seen more by our poorer people. And so the poor nutrition promotes the health inequities and the ethnic disparities that we have. So I've hopefully inundated you with this middle paragraph that we have a variety of diseases, but I'm adding a few more. You'll see the data on erectile dysfunction in urology journals. It's so important to understand that all of the things that go bad with people's, with them medically can be addressed by changing their diet. And so we really do need, as we come to hopefully the end of the dual pandemic and end up with the single pandemic again, we need to advocate. We need to get risk factors reduced by improving the microbiome and reduce the mortality associated with nutrition-related illness. Now, before closing, I have to tell you, and I left a minute to talk about something that is completely different. When I first started giving these lectures, it was all about the hypertension. Then it became about the hypertension and the cholesterol, and then it was obesity. And it's kind of like progressed over time, and it just being an ABC member, we were always talking about hypertension with good reason in the Black community. So that was where I started, but it got out of cardiovascular, got into renal. And now that I have 9 grandkids, I'm suddenly interested in the planet. And so for those of you who are still eating animal products, you got to understand that the eating animal products is not just bad for you. Sure, it has 100% mortality. I try to tease my patient, except it's not really a tease, it's true, that when they're eating a steak, it has 100% mortality for the cow. And so it turns out that raising these cattle, confining them, torturing them, putting them to death, and then cutting them up and selling them so that we can harm our brain, heart, and kidneys. None of that makes sense to the vegan cardiologists among us, but importantly, the planetary issues, not just the animal rights and human health, but the planetary issues are really coming to a head. And people think that it's really about driving cars. And it turns out that the CO2 is not nearly as bad as the methane. And so 23 times more potent when it talks about warming the planet and making the permafrost melt, which is then going to produce more methane and make global warming more self-sustainable. So I'm hoping that I've inundated you with, if you care about the planet, if you care about the finances of Medicare, if you're a patriot and you care about the country, care about the community, and the life expectancy of physicians, you'll all completely be vegan by the end of this lecture, which is about now. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to save a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. Questions, guys? Anyone have any comments for Dr. Williams?
Stunned into silence because the lunches were not as healthy, but this is hopefully not true. because you guys are in Southern California, so you've probably heard most of this stuff already, right?
I don't think we've heard most of it before. No.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm so glad to be able to share things that are different. It certainly opened my eyes. And yeah, being in Southern California really has changed my approach about planetary health and animal rights, because this was, for me, it was all about human health and just decreasing the cardiovascular burden. I mean, we thought we were going to be number 2, and then it didn't happen, and heart disease started to go up again. And it's up to us who are in prevention to get the lifestyles to change.
All right, guys, any questions before we let Dr. Williams? Thank you so much for hanging out with us for this hour. Really, really interesting data. Any questions, guys?
I have a question, and that is about fermented milk products. Many of them, like kefir, yogurts, and all those kind of things. We eat them up in the Nordic countries a lot. They've been associated with regions with longevity and so on. And I mean, they certainly can affect the microbiome. So I was curious about that.
So I would love to see some, prospective data. My suspicion is that, like most dairy products, and you'll see some, there was one of those studies where dairy actually had a mortality benefit. Most of it is not that way, but some of it is. I think a lot of that is a substitutionary benefit. That is, if they're eating fermented dairy instead of bacon, ham, and steak, that's going to improve life. That's going to improve longevity. And so these cultural differences are absolutely huge. If you put them through the filter of, well, what's better versus what's best, that's the kind of data that we need. I'd love to see, fermented like plants, as kombucha and all these things. Wouldn't it be nice to actually do a comparison there? And you could actually do that on a relatively short term if you're willing to accept, surrogate markers like risk factors. So if you want to do that trial, I'm down there with you. Thanks, Christina.
I have a question as well. So in our secondary prevention clinic, we talk about Mediterranean diet a fair amount. And that's even a bit of a stretch for patients to switch from their current diet to even Mediterranean diet. So what are some of the strategies that you found most successful in terms of trying to shift patients into a different way of thinking about their dietary intake?
Can I answer 2 questions there for a second, if you'll allow me to take a tangent and then go back to your question? You mentioned the Mediterranean diet, and that is commonly put out there. And it actually was graded as the #1 diet for human health last year by the US News and World Report. And they were quoting the 2018 republication of the 2013 Platelet trial. I encourage, if I could just ask you for one thing in return for me doing grand rounds, if you could do me one favor, and that is to, if you haven't seen that study lately, just Google it, bring it up, and look at the panel A, the very famous 30% reduction in heart and myocardial infarction, cardiovascular mortality, and stroke. It's a combined endpoint. And there was no difference between the extra virgin olive oil group or the nut group. But what's often missed is panel B in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that is that there was no difference in mortality. And then if you go to table 2, you will see the actual results numerically. What it showed is that there was no improvement. When you went from red meat to fish, there was no improvement in cardiovascular mortality, heart attack, or overall mortality. So what was with this combined endpoint? It was stroke. It's getting rid of red meat and eating fish instead dramatically improves the stroke rate. That drove the entire combined endpoint. And so if I was a neurologist, I'd be kind of jumping up and down, particularly at Rush, where we've got that, code stroke and everybody's trying to do thrombolysis and get the, well, it would be wonderful to have a 30% decrease. But for cardiologists, it does not help us in any way. Okay, so that's more than a tangent, but I needed to make sure that people look at every study. It's not just Platelet, look at every study and look at it critically to make sure that what you're taking away from it is actually what the paper says. Now, if you talk to the authors, Emilio Ross and these guys, they actually are completely, admitting that it did not improve mortality at all. And they thought maybe if it was a longer study, maybe that's true. But fact of the matter is they did publish a pro-vegetarian analysis, but it wasn't randomized. It was a post hoc analysis that best quintile versus the worst quintile in terms of vegetarianism. They called it the pro-vegetarian paper. You can pull that one. It was a 42% decrease in mortality. And so I would say that they have some of the best data supporting vegetarian diet than anything. Okay, now to your question.
I know, and I support that fully. I'm vegetarian, full disclosure, bordering on vegan, but yeah, I totally support that.
Well, thank you. Glad to hear that. So how do we change people? That's where I feel very fortunate to be a cardiologist, and I'm typically seeing people who have a problem. And they admit that they have a problem, or else they wouldn't be seeing me. I go on rounds and I'm not doing the intervention. So I come by I'm rounding in the CCU and I see the person after the stent is done. And I actually have the silliest conversation you've ever heard with them. I would say, can you please just bear with me for a minute and you'll understand why I'm asking you dumb questions after we're done. 4 questions. Number 1, what's your understanding of what happened to you? And they say, well, I had a heart attack and I had a heart that was blocked and they put in a stent. And I said, yep, that's exactly right. What was that artery blocked with? Question number 2, regardless of education level, most people can say plaque. And then I'll ask them, what is plaque made out of? And they'll say, I'm not sure, maybe cholesterol and fat. That's right. And where did the cholesterol and fat come from? And to a person, they will say, I ate it. So then I joke with them a little. I say, okay, I'm going to put you on a vegetarian diet. If you choose not to do it, we'll get to see you again. Okay, you'll improve our rush revenue, but hopefully you'll pay attention and you won't have to be back here doing this again. And so I'm saying that whole story to say that people who have a disease are so well motivated that if we give them the data, particularly in my little questionnaire scenario, get them to admit it themselves, I found that tremendously helps change their diet. Very few people will walk away from that admission and not have some impact on their diet.
Great, thanks so much. Bobak.
Hey,
hi Bobak, how are you? Good to see you again.
So, nutritional epi gets a lot of criticism based on its methods and quality of data. Dietary surveys are always best, based on recollection. Usually at one point in time, people's dietary habits might shift over many years. It's such a hard thing to measure and report. But, a lot of these studies, just being vegan tends to be really well correlated with other socioeconomic status factors that we don't understand, all the life stressors, the community people live in, the other healthy habits that go along with it. So it tends to be very hard to tease out, well, was it the plant-based diet, or was it all the things that go along with that sort of culture and identity that help contribute to maybe health differences that we see? So how do you approach the quality of studies and I'm just looking at the COVID study, you have like 250 patients and you're trying to adjust for things like age and a few other factors. Yep. You're going to overfit your models very quickly and all those biases come out.
Right.
So anyway.
Thank you for bringing that up. So thank you very much for pointing that out. I will secretly suggest your name as a reviewer because I believe that we need prospective randomized trials that are long-term, and all I get is pushback is that this is a settled issue. That nurses' health can't be wrong. Don't tell me that nurses and doctors, when they're sampled serially, don't know how to fill out a food frequency questionnaire. And it's Harvard anyway, and I do trust what they're saying, but healthy user bias, okay? That is when a person the two that are easy are the amount. You can talk about exercise in terms of how much people are doing. But plant-based people tend to, Kyrie Irving, Novak Djokovic, Venus Williams, they tend to have better recovery. So you could be exercising the same amount of time, but you're exercising harder. You can't measure that. How many vegans drive around without a seatbelt? How many of us hold our breath when we walk by somebody who's smoking? I mean, what you're saying is so true that you'll never be able to unweave healthy user biases. And the only way to do this is a prospective randomized trial. So anyway, I'm designing such and trying to, and I would welcome any partners who want to do it. Obviously, I'm going to be going, vegan versus Mediterranean because of the Fermented trial, and I'm hoping that people will look favorably and not say that it's settled that it's vegan or settled that it's Mediterranean, because I don't think it is.
What's your vision for the practicality? The hard thing about food is, people are eating 3 times a day, and if they don't know how to prep, a plant-based diet, how do you envision a trial where you replace, someone with their usual diet?
Right, and so highly successful. How much adherence did we have with the church intervention? 93%. Because they said, it's not a crime. You're not going to, suffer eternal religious consequences if you break your Lent vow. But just write it down. And when people turned it in, there was 93% adherence to the vegan diet, which again was delivered to them, much like the Mediterranean stuff and Fermented. They delivered the olive oil and stuff. So yeah. But you have to make it sustainable. So our next trial is going to have a month of educational intervention after they do the free food for a couple of months with crossing over between vegan and Mediterranean, then have the coaches move in and make sure that people know how to reproduce the good food that they've been eating and know how to prepare it, and doing it with a group model. There are plenty of such, you've heard of Dean Ornish's stuff, that's highly successful because of group behavior. And so when people are out there alone and their kids and their spouse are making fun of them, it's really hard. But if you get everybody to go along with it and they have a support group, it actually does work pretty well. So you're highlighting all the reasons that we need to do it, that trial, and we need to do it with the kind of coaching that'll make it sustainable.
So Dr. Williams, this is Dr. Modi. We go back to nuclear cardiology days. And it's interesting that we both evolved into preventive cardiology, so I do heart failure too.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that there was a recent trial recent meta-analysis that showed that LDL didn't correlate that well with CV outcomes from Dublin. And is it because we make too much of a deal of LDL? I know that it is probably a bad biomarker, but it might be more so in Caucasians. And that's why I think it's become such a big focus, while there might be so many other things like LP(a) and all that. And I think that in preventive cardiology, we need to look at these other biomarkers too, rather than just focus on LDL.
Well, thank you for that. And you saw that we did in our intervention. We were looking at pretty much everything. I would say the top 3 in my mind are C-reactive protein, Paul Ritker. We've got LDL cholesterol, particularly small dense, and we've got TMAO. And if they're not measuring the TMAO level and correcting the model for that particular issue, we're going to be missing it. That is, eating chicken and fish will raise your cholesterol just like eating red meat, but your TMAO level is going to be completely different. And so I would say that the cholesterol trialist data is pretty secure, and you're going to see some random variation around there saying it's more important or it's less important. But I would say that as I believe you're saying, we should not be looking at LDL alone.
Thank you.
I had a question. Does it look like the particular microbiome, is that dependent on the race of the individual, or it looks pretty similar across the human race?
I think the problem with race, particularly in the United States, is the preponderance of huge differences in what people eat. That is, my patients from Mexico, they all have central obesity, or else they're probably not going to be in cardiology clinic. And the diabetes, hypertension, and they're going to live longer than whites, the so-called Hispanic paradox. The Black people are going to have a higher creatinine, and they're going to have a more left ventricular hypertrophy, as Dan Savage tried to teach us 30 years ago. And so this is, everyone's a little different, and it's because of their dietary habits. There's so much more refined carbohydrates, fried in both populations, but refined carbohydrates and sugar, particularly sugar-sweetened beverages in my Mexican population, more sodium and saturated fat and organ meats with high cholesterol in my African-American population. And so I don't think we're going to have the same microbiome issues, but I would love to see a microbiome breakdown based on ethnicity. That's a wonderful idea for those of us who have microbiome analyses available to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we've passed the hour. So thank you
Sure.
again, Kim, for such an interesting conversation. Really appreciate it and love seeing you. And congratulations on your new job.
Well, thanks so much, Carol. And I know you and I will talk, and I really appreciate everybody tuning in, and hopefully, keep challenging the data, keep doing studies. We can change the world and keep the planet. Wouldn't that be good? Okay. All right. Take care now.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.